sticking around. We're going to go straight into our keynote with Nithya. I am very, very excited to be introducing the next keynote. Nithya and I have been, Nithya has been one of the guiding lights for me with regards to OSPOs and working in open source since I started at Cross 10 years ago. She is definitely no stranger to academic open source because she's one of the reasons why I feel like you're one of the reasons why academic OSPOs kind of got off the ground, because you started pointing out to people like me at Cross that I was actually doing OSPO-like work and I didn't know what an OSPO was. So I really appreciated that. Nithya has been in open source and open source program offices throughout industry, most recently Amazon, for decades now. And she has been part of the Cross community as an advisor also for at least 10 years or something like that, almost as long as I've been there. So yeah, for a really long time. Anyone who knows Nithya knows that she's passionate about open source, about bringing open source world and research universities together. But maybe more importantly for me in particular, she is really a critical mentor and role model to women in open source. And I probably would not be here today if it wasn't for Nithya on a lot of things. She has championed the idea that open source contributions go far beyond code. Encompassing governance, advocacy, documentation, you name it, all of the stuff that we all have to do. You have spent decades, I keep saying it like been around forever, but you've spent a good amount of time at the center of how open source actually works. She's been exceedingly impactful as the chair of the Linux Foundation, which is the capacity that she's speaking at today, and what she will focus on a lot on in her discussion. And she really is one of the reasons why I feel like many of us are here and are doing as well as we are in our open source efforts. So I'm really excited to have her talk today, and she will focus a lot about just a little bit of discussion for those of you who are new to some of the open source foundations, but also kind of some of the ideas that about how to bring university academic institutions, research institutions, and foundations and open source communities together. So without further ado, Nithya, to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much to the Open Summit organizers and to UC Berkeley for having me here. Frankly, I consider myself a Californian because I spent 30 years in California before I moved to North Carolina. I live in North Carolina now, so I'm a bit Carolinian, but also Berkeley and California. And frankly, there's no other place that's more fitting for this conversation today than Berkeley, because Berkeley, as a lot of you know, wrote the first chapter of open source from BSD. Oh, yes. Sorry. So I tried to use the blue and gold colors of Berkeley today in my presentation. Okay, let me go back to the fact that there's no other place that's more fitting to have this discussion than this hall here, because you, Berkeley, helped write the first chapter in open source with BSD in the early days to Apache Spark and Ray and RISC-V in the last 15 years. So when I talk about my role, the role of foundations in advancing open collaboration and innovation, I'm not talking abstractly. I'm really speaking about the work that started in the buildings around here. And then, how do we take it further? And a lot of these projects, frankly, have gone further and become industry standards and, part of the infrastructure that we all depend upon. And right now, the governance layer for AI is being determined, is being written, and we need to make sure universities are showing up as this important chapter is playing out. So let me see if I can do my notes and do my talking at the same time. Okay, so this is the tension that I want to kind of focus on to some extent in my talk. Universities have been a core part of AI development. AI would not be here without the contributions of universities.
everything from backpropagation to convolutional networks to transformers to Fei-Fei-Li's, reinforcement learning from human feedback has academic footprints and fingerprints all over it. Berkeley, Stanford, CMU, MIT, Toronto, they've all built the field. But universities today, I feel, are largely absent from the discussions that are going on governance, on safe AI, on guardrails, on policy around AI. And there's no seat that's been reserved for academia, it feels like. It's not a complaint that I'm making, it's just an invitation that we need more academics, whether it's students or professors or PhDs, at the table of working groups or policy making, discussions that are happening today, because this is going to shape how the world is going to look like in the coming future. And let's talk about the structural reality, and let's be honest and acknowledge what's happening, right? 70% of new AI PhDs are going to industry. Not a detour, but straight to industry. And it's a historic shift. No worries. It sounded like me. As recently as a decade ago, this ratio used to be like 50-50. And then, of course, the salary gap is a huge part of why a lot of PhDs, end up in industry. Millions are being offered. And it's a lot more than, what you would make as a tenured professor, perhaps. And so a lot of people are attracted to going there. But another important element to pay attention to is 90% of notable AI models are coming from industry. And I think a lot of us know from a small group of industry folks. So there's a lot of concentration happening in where AI is happening and where models are coming. In universities, I know cannot outcompete industry. There's money, there's compute, there's a lot of factors. But they don't have to. There's another path. And working together, foundations and academics, we can do better, I think, in shaping where AI is going. So why do foundations work? And I'm not talking specifically about the foundation I work in, which is the Linux Foundation. I think every foundation has a significant role to play in creating a neutral place for convening industry and competitors and students and government, et cetera, to work together and to build trust. Why not just publish papers, release code, and trust that the market will do the rest? It's because the market does not have a neutral IP foundation that foundations bring. So when Berkeley students donate code to the Apache Software Foundation or the Linux Foundation, the code is actually held in a neutral trust place. No single company can pull on it. No single country can, claim it. No single university has claim to it. Foundations really provide that neutral home for the intellectual property, but also for the governance and the community, et cetera. So they provide three things that no individual lab or individual company can provide by itself. First, as we said, neutral intellectual property, a legal structure that lets competitors collaborate, through antitrust. Second, shared governance. We all sit together and transparently decide how the project is run, how decisions are made, what is succession planning, how the funding is raised, how it's shared. And third is open infrastructure. A lot of CI, the release process, the trademark protection, the events team, the legal defense team, et cetera. So this really captures for you how everyone funds this common infrastructure, but no one person owns it or can hijack it. And that's important, I think, for sustainability of open source. So now I want to shift to some examples of how we've collaborated together, academics and foundations. So there's been a long history of this pipeline happening. I picked 6 projects that follow almost an identical arc, and several of them started here in Berkeley. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this section is that the path from university research to globally deployed infrastructure is not at all rare. It's actually not even accidental and not reserved for a set of superstars only. It is something that's well trodden, well understood, and we need to follow these paths or create new paths. So the path that most foundation projects from the university side have taken is very, very interesting. Stage 1 in university, a PhD student, a faculty advisor, student starts a project, and it's very interesting, and they do it on a whiteboard, then it goes to actual prototype. And in stage 2, someone in the team, or maybe it's culturally part of that institution like UCSC or Berkeley, where you say, I think this should be open source, okay? There's no doubt this should go open source. And then third, they hopefully start building community rather than just, post it and say, my job is done because I've posted it on GitHub. They start building community, or maybe unbeknownst to them, they start getting users, they start getting people who are contributing to the project. And then someone decides, I think it belongs, as you did, Stephanie, at Apache, because there is a similar project there. I like the governance model there. I like the oversight there. Or it belongs at the Linux Foundation or CNCF or PyTorch or Eclipse. So someone decides that it belongs there to sustain the project and to kind of continue the project. Now it has trademark protection in the foundation. It has a board. It has a security response team. It has an events team. It has a credible home that outlasts any founder. By the way, a lot of companies will also say, the reason I consume Spark or the reason I consume RISC-V is because it does not belong to any one company, and from a business continuity perspective, the risk is low that the license is going to change or it's going to go away. I know that it'll be protected and it's a community property. So let's start with the first project, RISC. And I actually had an opportunity to talk to Ali Goetze a few years ago, and I think Apache Spark, I believe, began as a project here in the AMP Lab in 2009. And Mattel Zaharia and his collaborators had a thesis about in-memory computation. And you know what? They really hit it out of the park. In 2012, they made a decision that shaped everything that came after. They decided, instead of commercializing it, that they would contribute it to the Apache Software Foundation, and therein was born the Apache Spark project. Within 2 years, it was one of the most active big data projects at Apache, and only after the community trust was established did Ali Goetze and his co-founders really start Databricks. And today, Databricks is valued at like $60 billion or something like that, crazy number. The sequence actually matters, foundation first or open source first, foundation, company second. If they had reversed it, I think you would not be hearing about Spark today. And the neutral home, frankly, was the unlock, and Berkeley really was the origin of that innovation. So let's talk about RISC-V. And I know we talked about the other hardware project just now, Open Road. And I think the path that RISC-V took was slightly different. RISC-V started, I believe, in 2010 as a 3-month teaching tool. And then Sonovic and Dave Patterson needed a clean instruction set for their grad students to use to build chips without paying licensing fees, because the world of hardware, there's lots of licensing. The teaching tool is now a global open CPU standard governed by the RISC-V International, and it has more than 350 organizational members in 70 countries. It ships in billions of devices. Graduate students from the original lab went on to found companies and to commercialize RISC-V. Think about the geopolitics for a moment. In a world where semiconductors have become contested between US and China and Europe, a neutral open standard originating from a university and governed by an international foundation is one of the only things every party agrees and is willing to build on. So Berkeley made that possible, and no single company could have done that. Ray, another star. So this one started, I believe, very, very recently in 2016 as a class project in the RISE lab to scale distributed AI training. The founders launched AnyScale to commercialize it. But in 2025, just last year, they decided to donate the project, the open source part of it, to the Linux Foundation. And it sits in the PyTorch Foundation. So now we have PyTorch, VLLM, and Ray as core infrastructure for the open AI compute stack. By the way, 39,000 GitHub stars, 237 million downloads. OpenAI, Uber, Netflix all run on it. If you want to notice something, Ray is not old, it's legacy, so this pattern is still happening. And on this campus especially, the academic to foundation pipeline is not nostalgia, it's actually active. And the students writing their class projects this very semester may be creating the next Ray, and I'm excited for it. One of my favorite projects, and the reason I got into being a visiting scholar at UCSC, is Ceph. So I was working for SanDisk at the time, and SanDisk was exploring using Ceph in one of our servers. And we started then working with SageWhile and Inktank, and then I'll talk about how I then got involved in Cross as well. So this one did not start in Berkeley, just down the road in UC Santa Cruz, and SageWhile was doing his PhD at the time. It was funded by the Department of Energy, and by 2010, the Ceph client, I believe, was merged into the Linux kernel. So again, merge into existing ecosystems as opposed to a standalone project. And then went on to co-found a commercial company around Ceph called Inktank. And then it was later acquired by Red Hat, and it was Red Hat Ceph for quite some time. In 2018, the Linux Foundation actually launched the Ceph Foundation, specifically to make sure it had a neutral home and a neutral governance instead of living under one single vendor. The project thrived, and there were years of tension, though, when it was Red Hat Ceph, for example, and not everyone's Ceph. The foundation resolved that by kind of moving into a neutral home, and it really reminds us that federal research funding, the DOE in this case, can seed infrastructure that lasts any administration or any company if it lands in the correct place, whether it's Apache or Eclipse or LF, etc. So the way I got involved in Cross, so working at SanDisk, UCSC very smartly started Cross, which is Center of Research for Open Source Software. It was mainly in the storage area, thanks to Carlos Matzan. And then that's when I met Stephanie and Carlos, joined the advisory board, and I've been immensely grateful for the education in how academic open source works. Now I'm going to take you to the East Coast, to actually New York City and NYU. So this one is NYU Tandon. How many of you know Professor Justin Kapos? Exactly. I include it because it disproves the idea that only famous schools can do open source or, get famous projects out, etc. Justin's lab has produced not one or two, but 5 Linux Foundation projects: Tough, Intoto, Obtain, GitTough, and more. And all of them started in the same way, NSF or DHS funded, and then they graduated into production use. Tough became the first security-focused CNCF project to reach graduated status. So all these foundations have kind of an incubation process. You're in the incubation process, then when you meet certain criteria, you graduate from there. It now runs inside Amazon, Google, Microsoft's supply chain security. And just as importantly, the students went on to industry, to Datadog, to faculty positions and industry. And most of the reason they were recognized and invited to join those companies was because of their open source work, not because of anything else. Tandon became a Linux Foundation associate member, and I believe Justin sits on the governing board of CNCF, so a faculty participating in the governance of open source foundations and projects. And a generation of students got to build a career built on their credibility in open source and not because of anything else. You in Berkeley have done this again and again and again. I give you a lot of credit for creating the model, if you will. The last project I'm going to speak about is called Chaos, and it's slightly different from the other projects. Chaos is community health analytics for open source software. I included this because it's slightly different. It's not a piece of infrastructure or software. It is 15 years plus of academic research on open source community health. Think of it as metrics, measurement methods, working definitions, etc. So methodology that universities use and the high caliber and quality of methodology that universities use that now open source gets to benefit from. It started at Universidad Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid, and then we have collaborators from Missouri, Nebraska, Omaha, and Victoria, and beyond. And it's important because the academic research methods are the product here. It's not software. The metrics that companies now use every single day to determine, should I invest in this project? What's the health of this project? Can I rely on this project, or is it going to die? Who's contributing to this project? Is it heavy on one company, etc.? Really comes from Chaos. This is dedicated, and there is also a dedicated university and academic working group inside Chaos. So if you're a social scientist or an economist or a policy researcher listening and thinking this is all computer science only, no, it isn't. Chaos is proof that the academic rigor and work that you do belongs in open source and in worldwide infrastructure. So the pattern is very, very clear. The research done in academia was the seed. Foundations provided the soil, but the community, as many, many of you have acknowledged, community was the sun. Without the sun, we could not have grown, and that is an important combination. Okay, now to talk about the fact that I said, I wish we had more academics at the table in AI governance. This is the section I really want us to provide more attention to, because universities have the largest opportunity here, but we have the smallest amount of time. Unlike these other patterns, which took like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, things are moving at warp speed right now, and we don't have much time. Policies and governance is being built in like 18 to 36 months, and things are really, really moving fast, and if we are not in the room, I think we will inherit a system that we have to live with, and that won't be a good world. So in foundation working groups and in the open source initiative and Linux Foundation AI and Data, Eclipse, etc., there are 4 questions at least that are being discussed, but much more. Like in the Agentic AI Foundation, for example, we're saying, what are the new risks we have with agents? How do we keep a human in the loop? Should agents be autonomous, in a complete workflow, etc.? So the questions that are being asked, what does open mean for AI? Is it just the weights? Is it the software? Is it the algorithm? Is it, the data as well, the documentation, right? From an open science perspective, I think it's all of the above. If you want to reproduce something, you need everything, right? Open. But sometimes you cannot open data because it's copyrighted or it's proprietary or companies, it's the secret sauce for a lot of companies, so they won't open it. So, organizations like LFAI and Data Commons is looking at a more pragmatic level as well. So they have tiers of openness, right? One being just weights, and then another being everything. And that's why it's important to call, models like Llama and DeepSeek, et cetera, as open weights, not open source, because not everything is open. There are restrictions on the license, et cetera. So the answer is going to shape licensing. We have to define this correctly. And then who evaluates AI systems? Which benchmarks are credible? Who audits the auditors of these things? How do we govern across borders? How do we stay global? When training data is international, deployment is international, and regulation tends to be very national, right? Europe has its own regulations. In fact, in the US, we have state-by-state regulations, which make it even more complex. And all of these things are being discussed: model cards, safety cards, eval reporting, incident disclosure. The governance layer is being written by whoever shows up at those meetings and those working groups. It is a procedural fact, and right now the whoever is mostly industry and mostly a few companies that are showing up. But it can change if academics can participate and bring their perspective to the table. The 2 forces that, in my mind, is creating more urgency is federal grants. There's a lot of funding pressure, and I don't need to tell you this. The NSF, the NIH, DOE, they're all under strain. The pressure is not going to go away. Foundations could be one of the realistic alternatives or another source, not because they replace the federal dollars one for one, but because their neutral IP networks eliminate some of the legal issues like conflict of interest friction that makes industry kind of nervous about working with academia, and academia nervous about working with industry. Companies have to pick sides, and their shareholders require it, but universities, guess what, are neutral. Have an international mandate, your students come from everywhere, you work on global research, and it's not a weakness in the governance infrastructure. It's the single most valuable thing universities can bring: their neutrality, their global mindset, and also your long-term thinking mindset. And window is open right now for universities to participate more in the AI governance discussion. What are 5 things that universities bring to the table? One is the independent benchmarking. Frankly, when a frontier lab publishes a leadership score, the world doesn't trust it. When Stanford HAI or Berkeley AI Research lab publishes an evaluation, the world says, yeah, this is objective, this is, trustworthy. The credibility is a resource that no industry can buy. Second, your long horizon safety research. Industry quarters are 90 days long, whereas PhD theses are 4 to 6 years long. And you have that longer horizon mindset, and only universities can kind of run on it. 3, you all are in the business of literacy and education. You reach tens of thousands of students every year, and those students will be shaping where we are going with AI. The curriculum you build is the closest thing society has to a public education system for AI. So let's take that responsibly. 4 is the translation layer. Universities are where computer scientists, lawyers, ethicists, economists, librarians, policymakers all come together. That cross-disciplinary translation is hard to do inside a single company. We are all kind of, wedded to our own departments. 5, geopolitical neutrality, which we already discussed. Industry has compute, yes, and they have data centers, yes, and they have money. But you have credibility, you have independence, and some time. These are not second prize assets in the governance discussion. They are the main assets, so we need you at the table. The collaboration playbook. So a couple of things that I want to share in terms of what we can do together. I'll give you a pattern. Now I want to do it in a more concrete fashion for graduate students, for researchers, and for faculty. Every single one of these is something you can start on before the semester actually starts or ends. Okay, for graduate students, I think there are 3 doors that are really open, and I know I'm being very Linux Foundation centric, but there are lots of other avenues in Apache and other organizations that you should pay attention to. The LFX mentorship program, for example, at the Linux Foundation, it pays stipends. You actually work on real production work on projects that you may use or industry uses. There are 3 terms a year, and it's full-time and part-time options. The second, I think, is one of my favorites, which is the Linux kernel mentorship program led by Showa Khan and a bench of expert maintainers that support her. If you've ever wondered what it would take, how much time it would take to submit a patch to the Linux kernel, this is the program. And imagine your legacy. I have submitted a patch to the kernel, and it is everywhere in the world. Former mentees consistently describe it as life-changing. It's open, frankly, to all backgrounds. You don't have to be a kernel maintainer to kind of be in the running. And of course, Google Summer of Code is extremely well known. I know UCSC and others participate in it as mentors and as mentees. It lends a lot of credibility to your work, particularly today, where you need to stand out, where a lot of what CompSci graduates, would depend upon as entry-level employees is completely getting changed, right? When coding and testing is kind of now taken over by coding assistants or other tools, you need to shift your value to systems level thinking, real world experience, validation, and cross company, cross organization thinking, cross discipline thinking. Okay, for researchers, the playbook used to be publish paper, present at conferences, move on, and maybe you reached a few hundred, people. If you're lucky, you reached thousands. But I would want to challenge you to do a couple of things. One is think about what are the artifacts that you can contribute to open source. The data set, the benchmark, the toolkit, the evaluation harness, not just as a tarball on your personal website or some anonymous GitHub website, but as perhaps into an existing project or an existing ecosystem or a foundation where there are real users, real maintainers, etc. The same work can reach thousands of production deployments instead of hundreds of readers. The citation count follows, and this can be also create funding. I'll use just one example here. The eBPF Foundation has given out $250,000 grants to researchers at CMU, Rutgers, and EPFL specifically to bring academic artifacts to the table, to the open source stack. Similarly, there are grant programs at OpenSSF and CNCF and AI Alliance, et cetera, that you can, partake of. Ask, where can your next artifact belong even before you create it and before you publish it? And we kind of touched on it at UCSC, that should the criteria for how, professors are measured kind of be modified so that they're incented to open source and to publish, and does that count towards their tenure rather than just publishing a paper? Okay, for faculty, I think building a bridge to industry and to real-world examples is, there's a few examples here. When you choose capstone and thesis projects, can you choose more real-world projects and real, areas that the students can work in? The second is academic membership. I think UCSC, Berkeley, et cetera, are members of foundations that help. And NYU Tandon, others have done this. I'll go quicker because I used up a lot of time before. Academic accreditation, there are CNCF, OpenSSF, credentials that you can acquire along with your educational credentials. The biggest investment you can make is a university OSPO, which I think you've all done very, very well. And then bringing all the cross disciplines across the university into a dialogue is extremely important. And I just want to also say, foundations can be an alternate source of funding and collaboration. Big shout out to the UC system and the UC Open Source Program Office Network. Really appreciate you all. 3 asks for graduate students. Think about making one open source contribution to a foundation project before you graduate. To researchers, ask, where can I put my artifacts? Can I give it to a foundation? Can I put it in an ecosystem where it'll thrive and it'll add value? For faculty, start conversations across the campus and support your OSPO. Make sure your OSPO is involved in your discussions. I think it's going to be crucial, especially in AI. And that's it. Let's be present where AI began. I just want to kind of say it properly. We were present, as academics when AI began, but now let's show up where AI is going. Thank you.
Few minutes since I did the technical difficulty at the beginning. A few minutes for questions. Are you doing? Yeah, I'll do the other end. And I was glad my phone didn't go off. Any questions? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Nithya, for the talk. Very much enjoyed it. I wanted to ask about a part on AI where I think you skipped really. Let me explain with an analogy to Linux. 30 years ago, Microsoft was winning the operating system wars, and arguably you could say the industry in some brilliant moment recognized they couldn't fight it. So they joined forces, ganged up on Microsoft, or simply acted in self-defense, whichever way you want to view it, and supported Linux. So now we have a much better situation than one dominant operating system that eats everyone's profit margins. So now, fast forward to AI. We don't know who is winning in the AI war, Anthropic, OpenAI, maybe someone else. But we do know, I'm pretty sure, there may well be one dominant foundation model that everyone depends on. Nobody except the owner of that model will want that. It's exactly like Microsoft winning the operating system wars, I would argue, with technology somewhat different. So when you talked about what we as or what academics can do in the Linux Foundation on that, all that governance came later. First, we needed Linux back then, and then came governance from various foundations on additional other open source projects that enhanced everyone. So here is, where are we going to get that neutral, open, foundational model? There's no point, if you ask me, in quibbling about what does open mean if you don't even have a foundation model that could spare with the winner, the commercial winner.
Yeah, Dirk got right to the elephant in the room. Yes, I still think the governance and speaking up about responsible AI is just as important. But you're right, there's a gap. We don't have a fully open source foundation model. And that needs to be corrected. And I frankly don't have answers here in terms of how we do that. But that is a big gap. And that could be kind of the unifying neutral layer around the world. To be honest, there are two centers of gravity happening today, China and US. And if the rest of the world needs to adopt a neutral model, we need an open source based model. And so other countries can use it and kind of customize it for their use. Yeah, that's a gap. And I don't know if any of you have answers for how we correct that gap.
Thanks, Nithya, for a really thought-provoking and informative talk. I noticed in your examples, right, there's even with projects that are under foundations, there are these variations. Some, like Spark, are under the Linux Foundation. RISC-V made its own foundation. And then Ceph, I understand, is under the Linux Foundation, but it has its own Ceph Foundation. So I wonder if you can shed light on, what are the decisions, what are the parameters under which these particular types of models make sense? Why did they go that route?
It's a pretty long discussion, but I think when a project is born, a lot of teams kind of look to see what the ecosystem closest to that project is. If you're a Python project, should you be closer to the Python Foundation, or should you be separate? So we first kind of determine, is there an ecosystem we belong in? And then sometimes funding plays a role. If they're an independent foundation, it's because maybe they want to raise money and have it directed towards that particular project. Because if you sit, for example, in an umbrella foundation like CNCF, you're one of lots of projects, and you get bits and pieces of funding from the main funding. So those are some of the considerations. Funding, or maybe you need a unique governance model. You don't want to kind of just sit into an existing governance model. Organizations like Apache have a very strong culture, and they have a very consistent culture across projects. And so if you like that sort of governance, you would go there. Linux Foundation is a little more laissez-faire about how you set up your foundation, except there are certain guidelines. So those are some of the considerations, governance, freedom, money, ecosystem, yeah.
I think we had one more question and then we have to wrap up.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So my question is a little bit about the sort of like life cycle of how these open source projects launch out of universities and achieve some sort of steady state. I feel like in the early stages of an open source project, in some ways it's like well matched to how universities are used to operating. It's like R&D focused, it's creating new things. And when something becomes stable enough that you want to build like a multi-stakeholder foundation or structure around it, it requires a different kind of engagement from the people from the organizations in order to participate. I've seen this, so I'm on the board of the Jupyter Foundation, which is like a big open source project. And I found that like the assumptions that we make about how a university or how an organization can participate, they don't hold the same for a university versus a company. Like a company has a much more coherent, coordinated structure, they pay $100,000 to be on the board. So they like have a strategic investment in it. They appoint a person. And like universities don't operate like that. You know, they're more like a collection of small businesses in a trench coat. And so I'm wondering, like, for the different foundations that you've seen, I assume that in some cases it's worked better than in others, their ability to engage the academic world. And I'm curious, like, what stands out to you about what those foundations do different to make it easier or more natural for academics to engage versus the ones where it seems like there's just more friction or it's harder to do so?
I know the Linux Foundation very well, but I don't know the systems that Apache, Eclipse, etc. use for engaging with the academic community. So I need to do a little more research there. On the LF side, perhaps accidentally, you know, we started acquiring or started getting projects from academia like CEF and others, and then started seeing patterns, and then started saying, how do we make it easier for academics to engage, you know, like in Chaos, setting up academic working group. I've been discussing with Stephanie and others, how can we make it more friendly to academics? How can we co-locate academic conversation, you know, conferences like ACM with Open Source Summit, for example, so that there's more interaction? How can we make it more easy to discover what's happening in academia in terms of research? Today, to me, it's a black box. I don't know what UC is working on and how it relates to, you know, company needs and other needs. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think we are being more intentional today, having seen the patterns, to become more friendly to academia. And your OSPO can play an incredible role in building a bridge and making it easier to traverse the world of foundations and other open source groups. Is that helpful?
Right. Well, thank you so much, Nithya. Thanks to everybody for the great questions. I think we get Nithya another round of applause.